Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we are very glad today to be joined by Aakaash Rao, who's a PhD candidate in economics at Harvard University, who researches political persuasion with a focus on the media, as well as Shakked Noy, who is a PhD student in economics at MIT, who studies topics relating to the economics and politics of attention. Shakked and Aakaash, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So I wanted to bring you both on here to talk about a recent paper of yours that I stumbled upon that was published just recently called The Business of the Culture War. And I want to dive right in here and quote from the paper, quote, "We link the contemporary American culture war to changes in media technologies in the 1980s and to the cable news networks which responded to the new incentives of the era," end quote. So here at Project Censored, we are a critical media literacy project, and we call this junk food news, the reporting that entertains rather than informs the public. And this entertainment can be very insidious. It's not necessarily just who Kim Kardashian is sleeping with. It focuses on sensational yet inconsequential topics, diverting attention from more important stories, as well as news abuse. Genuinely newsworthy stories like healthcare or access to abortion or things like that the establishment press covers in ways that obscure or distort the story's most important points. So I wanted to just start off here, and you use culture war or culture versus economics, and I found that to be an interesting choice. Why specifically did you choose economics as that counterweight as opposed to some other quote unquote political issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a division that has clearly become both within academic circles and then also in the popular discourse really important. This, idea that political parties are talking about culture war issues in order to distract from an unpopular economic agenda, for example. So, in 2024, think of Trump's, they, them ads. Trump was not talking very much about Medicaid or SNAP. And so clearly this economics versus culture distinction is there. I think really the more fundamental distinction of the paper is a little closer to you were talking about earlier, which is kind of what is sensational, what grabs the public's attention, what gets them to watch TV or click on a new headline, versus what is the content that, if you had some kind of omniscient person choosing what's best for society, what you would actually want aired. And so I think that's really the key distinction. It happens that there are some relations to that in economics versus culture, which we explore in the paper. But really, I think the key distinction is closer to what you're talking about at the beginning, what is sensational and inflammatory and entertaining versus what actually kind of informs the public and matters.
I should add that another reason to be interested specifically in the distinction between economics and culture is that something that political scientists have documented is that over the past 60 or 70 years of American politics, there's a very clear transition from a period where voters' behavior is really defined by their stance on economic issues like taxation, redistribution, regulation, and labor issues. So think about, the Democrats as the party of unions and the working class. Taxation and regulation are very salient political issues, and a transition from that to the modern era where voters are more divided by their views on identitarian and cultural issues relating to race, gender, immigration, patriotism, religion, and so on. And where now Republicans are the party of non-college educated, often working class voters who tend to be culturally conservative, whereas Democrats have become more the party of highly educated people who are culturally liberal. And so part of the motivation of looking at this distinction between the issues that are sensational and attract attention and the issues that are maybe more important is to try to understand why that transition occurred and what the role of changing media technologies that maybe allowed the entry of more sensational news might be in explaining that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when I was reading the paper, I was reminded of this political cartoon that shows two tables, and in front of the table labeled comfortable lies, like there's a line that stretches off into infinity. And in front of the table labeled uncomfortable truths, there's like one guy, or maybe there's nobody. And I felt like there was a bit of a chicken and an egg question here. Are people pushed more, or as you say, mobilized, to tune into this junk food news because it's there, and that's what happens when you just click on your TV? Or is it there because media companies know how our ape brains work and started programming based on our inability to stay away from vapid but sensational news?
We tend to think it's more the latter, that there is this consumer demand for this kind of content. And in the absence of forces to kind of restrain the market is going to supply inflammatory, sensational, attention-grabbing content. And you had some of these restraining forces in, for example, the era of the three big networks, 1950s to 1980s, where, networks had liberty to talk about what they wanted to some extent, but they were also really worried about regulation by the FCC, and they faced other kind of pressures that meant that they really couldn't lean as much into some of this sensational, attention-grabbing stuff as possible. And so, of course, there were other problems. It's certainly not the case that this was a utopia of media freedom in the 1950s to the 1980s, but there were these obstacles that made it more difficult for media producers to lean in to this kind of content. And then when you had the era of deregulation and increased media choice and the expansion of cable technology, which we discuss, and then of course later with internet news and social media, as you have this vast proliferation of other options where there are much fewer barriers to entry and much fewer kind of regulatory constraints, you're naturally going to see an explosion of the kinds of content that cater to kind of these baser preferences or these kind of urges for attention grabbing or sensational content.
Well, and I'm also reminded as you were talking that about perhaps this is very very turtles all the way down. I'm thinking of a meme, so it shows how programmed I am. But it was something that basically said we were never meant to have this much access to this much dumb information. And I mean, y'all talk about cable technology and the deregulation, and I'm wondering how then that relates in your research to social media and internet news. I mean, literally, I can scroll through something that says blueberries cure cancer. It's like we have so much access to so much dumb information. How does that then relate? And I want to get into the economics of the cable news networks and their kind of economics thinking about this. But just in terms of this level of access to information that is not vetted, information that is not news in any stretch of that imagination, how is that then part of this fueling of the culture war?
I think what we've seen happen with the internet and social media over the past 15 years is very much an extension and kind of deepening of the earlier transition that happened from broadcast to cable news, where what you see is a fragmentation of the media ecosystem and an intensification of competition for attention. And one thing that social media algorithms were really crucial in doing was allowing the content that is the most attention grabbing and activates people the most be surfaced and distributed to people in an extremely efficient way. And so all of that just deepened the incentives for the producers of content and the producers of news to try and find the stuff that is most attention grabbing and is going to be rewarded with the most viewership, engagement, boosting in the algorithm, and so on. So we very much see social media and the internet as a kind of natural extension of the trend line that starts with the transition from broadcast to cable news.
So I want to dip into the economics, like I said, and you all point out that politicians actually who do focus on economics rather than the culture war junk food news actually do better in their elections. Mamdani is an example, a very recent example. One that I've used in the past is in West Virginia, where I've done a lot of organizing work. Bernie Sanders was a favorite in 2016 during the primary, and then West Virginia heavily voted for Trump. So this contradiction would then seem to support the idea that so-called cable news outlets are in fact entertainment, like e-news. They're not in the business of informing the public, nor do they care to. And as you write, quote, we conclude that cable news focus on the culture war reflects a distinctive business strategy focused on audience size maximization through mobilization, a strategy which is structurally disadvantaged for politicians and less aligned with broadcast news historical objectives, end quote. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about where your research led you, to distinct decisions, or was it just that the evidence was so overwhelming that, well, this is clearly an economic choice with regards to this, and why you think that the cable news networks are clearly rather flippant about whether politicians are actually doing better or doing better by focusing on quote unquote culture wars.
Yeah, I think there are two different things here. So one is, I think in the public discourse, there's this sense that Fox News exists to make people Republican and to make them vote Republican. And there's a sense that MSNBC exists to make people vote Democrat. And, this is the favorite subject of media critics on both sides of the aisle, right? That the mainstream media, whether it's broadcast or whether it's cable or something else, is biased against them. And, there might be some element of truth to this. I think the way we see it is that any political effects are really incidental to the actual mission of these businesses, which is to make money. And so, I don't think it's that Fox News doesn't care about their effects on politics, or MSNBC doesn't care about their effects on politics, but I think it's the case that primarily these are businesses and they exist to make money. And so any effects on politics are kind of incidental to that business strategy. And I think you can probably say the same about, social media as well, that, we now know, we have a huge amount of evidence that social media has really important spillovers outside of just the product, right? All of this work on mental health effects and body image of young women and negative mental health effects on older people. It's probably not the case that these networks don't care at all about these things. But again, it's incidental to the main business, which is making money. And so the way we see it is that culture war was first and foremost a business strategy designed to attract an audience. And kind of its effects on politics was incidental to that business strategy.
And I should add that, so you asked about whether cable news is really just entertainment and where the difference between cable news and politicians might come from. And one of the distinctions that's key to the paper is to say, look, the problems that face news networks and politicians in some ways are very similar to each other. So news networks are trying to attract viewers, politicians are trying to attract voters, and both of them are choosing a mix of issues to talk about in order to attract viewers or voters. And they can get those viewers or voters from kind of two different places. So if I'm a politician, for example, I'm a Democratic candidate, I can try to poach voters away from voting for my opponent in the race, or I can try to mobilize and turn out new voters who otherwise would not have voted at all. And similarly, if I'm CNN, I can try to poach viewers away from MSNBC or ABC or Fox News, or I can try to mobilize people who wouldn't otherwise watch news, who might be watching reality TV or might be watching sports or TV shows or something like that. And what we observe in the paper is that politicians and news networks value these different outcomes differently. Because if you're a politician and you're trying to win the election, all you care about is getting more votes than your opponent does. And so it's kind of a double payoff to poach voters away from your opponent. Because every voter that you poach from your opponent is +1 for you and -1 for them. Whereas every voter you turn out is just +1 for you. And so you should focus on the content that's best for poaching people who are kind of in the middle and deciding between you and your opponent. But if you're a news network and you just care about the total number of viewers that you get so that you can sell them ads, you're indifferent. You don't care about whether the extra viewer that you're getting is coming from watching one of your competitors or coming from watching reality TV or sports. And so what that means is that relative to the politician, you should focus much more on the content that's good at mobilizing people who otherwise would not watch the news, which in this case mostly turns out to be people who would otherwise be watching entertainment channels on TV. And so if that's your incentive, if your incentive as a news network is to cater to the kinds of people who would otherwise be watching entertainment, you're going to offer a product that tries to be as entertaining as possible and satisfy the desire for entertainment that those people have. And so you're going to try offering content that is entertaining and inflammatory and activating in some of the same ways that reality TV or sports or TV dramas are. And that's what we argue that cable news is doing with its focus on the culture war. And in fact, we have some evidence in the paper. We show using these consumer surveys that when these cable news networks enter in the 1980s and 1990s, the kinds of viewers that they attract are the viewers who previously actually were not watching that much news, but were watching a lot of entertainment. And similarly, we show using some data from smart TVs today that when you talk more about culture war content on your news channel, you're mostly attracting viewers who are switching away from entertainment channels. Whereas when you talk about economics, you're actually mostly attracting viewers who are switching from other news channels. And so it's very much the case that cable news, when they're talking about culture war issues, it looks to us in the data like what they're doing is similar to what the entertainment channels are doing, rather than similar to, for example, what the broadcast news channels used to be doing in the 1950s to the 1980s.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about like the perhaps things that are far more difficult to quantify, but another thing that popped into my head, I suppose this is my ADHD brain, while reading your piece was the movie Network, and how prophetic that was. And this commodification of outrage, right? Even if that outrage comes from a very legitimate place, right? And how easily that outrage can then be twisted and bent into a weapon for people to fight one another, as opposed to aiming that towards the architects of our oppression. And I'm curious, in what you found and what you studied and researched, was your feeling that, well, their goal wasn't really to divide us, it's just to make money? Or does it feel like, well, of course, the capitalist goal is always to make money, but isn't it really convenient to divide the people? And so they're not focusing on real issues so that we can continue to deregulate and continue to dismantle, you know, these the paltry systems that existed in this country to actually protect people and make sure that there's some kind of safety net. What is your feeling about that? Or is that just kind of a bit of a opaque question?
You actually have the #1 authority on the movie Network on this call, so I'll let Shakked answer that.
Oh, yay. Love.
I wouldn't say that. I'm just a huge fan of the movie. And actually, I believe we cite it in the paper. It's in the reference list, cited as a movie. So firstly, I want to make just a quick tangential observation, which I think is interesting, which is that the media critics during the network era of the 1950s to 1980s, like the movie Network, like Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, are very focused on this idea that the news networks are leading into sensationalism in a way that distracts us from the important issues. But an interesting fact is that that tendency had not yet latched on to the partisan divides in the US. It's not obvious why this was the case. Part of the reason was probably that because you just have 3 broadcast networks, what a lot of kind of media scholars say is that the kind of equilibrium game that these networks were playing was to try to attract as broad an audience as possible by being as inoffensive as possible and not alienating anybody. Whereas when the cable channels entered and suddenly you had dozens of choices, suddenly the correct strategy was to try to attract a niche audience who really, really liked you. And that you could do by leaning into partisan divisions. And the other potential reason for this was a regulation called the Fairness Doctrine that the FCC imposed on broadcasters and broadcast radio, which required them to present controversial issues in a balanced way, and so sort of prevented overt partisanship on the news network. So it's just interesting that these tendencies towards sensationalism were evident in the 1950s to the 1980s and were noticed by media scholars, but didn't really kind of get lit into the raging partisan culture war inferno that we have today, potentially because of some of these constraints. In terms of the broader question of whether this is being done deliberately, kind of for political goals. I think it's not clear. I think Aakaash alluded to a debate among economists about whether news networks are biased just because that happens to be the profit maximizing thing to do, or because they actually have some direct interest in, Fox News wants Republicans to win elections. I would say there's mixed evidence on this. There's a very famous economics paper that looks at newspapers and finds that mostly newspapers are at the profit maximizing amount of slant, and there doesn't seem to be evidence that they attach any extra value to being partisan just for its own sake. There's also a paper that looks at Fox News specifically and suggests that Fox News maybe is actually too extreme to be justified purely on profit grounds, and suggests that to some extent it might be doing that deliberately in order to elect Republicans. And you can also read there's a lot of reporting around the kind of decision making that occurs behind the scenes at Fox News, and it at least appears from that reporting that these decision makers are thinking about the electoral and political consequences of what they're doing. So I certainly think it's plausible that there's some amount of that going on, although I would say that we don't have really good evidence on how important that is relative to the profit motives, which do also seem very important. I think there's also a danger in attributing too much unity to kind of all of the actors in this space. In reality, right, these are a bunch of different actors, each trying to do their own thing. The executives at Fox News and Republican politicians and billionaires who are donating to the Republican Party. So I wouldn't be confident that there's a large amount of unity of purpose and deliberate strategy in what they're doing. And it might make more sense to focus on immediate individual incentives like the profit maximization of the news network. But I would say it certainly seems like there might be some of that going on.
Did you want to add anything, Aakaash? Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, I can't remember the name of the show. I watched like a couple of a few episodes of what was it called? The Newsroom. Where
Sorkin.
yeah. And there's this great episode where they want to basically set up questions for the Republican debate. And they're these really solid questions that ask about policy and And then they're just like, no, we're not using that at all. And then their opening question is like, what is your favorite Elvis Presley song? And I was like, this is the most spot on. This is the spot on representation of like, oh no, we can't actually ask them about policy because they don't know what the hell they're talking about, but they can answer a question about Elvis Presley. And I thought that was a great representation. So kind of wrapping up here, I know that this is not really the goal of your paper, but I'm curious if in your research or just in your experience outside of this paper, something that we talk about on Project Censored is a lot of solutions journalism, and the idea that it's not enough to just say like, here's the problem. One of the things that we really need to do is prescribe things. Like one of the things that we prescribe a lot is critical media literacy. Know that you're being lied to. Know how to pick that out. And so I'm curious if y'all have, based on this, some prescriptions that you found in your research and in this experience based on what you found with this business of culture war.
I think there are kind of different policies or different solutions you might have in the political arena versus in the media arena. And so we talked a little bit about Mamdani before. Mamdani is an interesting example of someone who is able to generate the kind of attention, what we would call mobilization, that is generally better affected by culture war discourse, right? And so the Republican Party has been very effective in using culture war discourse to generate attention. And in general, what our research indicates is that cultural issues, culture war topics tend to be better at generating attention, even if they work less well in politics. One thing that's interesting about Mamdani's campaign to us is that he was able to generate virality and this mass kind of attention and mass movement focusing on the kinds of issues that have typically been presented in an extremely boring way, right? So free buses and affordability and even universal childcare, these have not been issues that when the Democrats talk about, everyone is tuning in. And something about the way he was able to run this campaign gave him kind of a double dividend, right? In that, as our research indicates, these economic issues are both more effective at persuading people to vote for you, and somehow he was able to generate virality and attention. So not only for each person that this message reached was it more effective at persuading them, it also just reached a whole bunch more people. And so there's something interesting about that campaign that politicians can learn from. Obviously, the types of politics that work in New York are very different than the types of politics that'll work in Cleveland or in rural West Virginia. But thinking about how to use this kind of virality and these kind of narrative strategies in conjunction with the issues that serve the Democrats best, which now seem to be things like affordability and healthcare, could be really effective for politicians. Shakked, do you have anything you want to add?
Not on politics, but
yeah, on media maybe.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say what the specific prescriptions are. I think we've come away from this project with a sense that unrestrained competition for attention is dangerous in that it leads to these kinds of very unhealthy dynamics. And at least historically, some constraints and guardrails that prevented unrestrained competition for attention seem to have been effective at kind of maintaining more normalcy and less partisanship in politics. I think where we go from here is not so clear, right? Like one way to go would be to say, oh, we need to bring back regulation of the media. And I think that, that kind of thing could be very dangerous in a much more partisan atmosphere.
As we saw 2 months ago.
As we've seen recently with the way that the current chairman of the FCC is willing to sort of wield the, currently fairly limited powers of that office. So giving a lot more power to the chairman of the FCC maybe doesn't seem like the ideal thing to do at this point. So it's hard to say where to go from here because those kinds of constraints on attention tended to be self-sustaining, where they produced this virtual cycle where they produced an environment with fairly limited partisanship, where then the guardrails could also be sustained in a way that wasn't wielded for partisan gain very much. So it's hard to say where to go. I think certainly an area that seems, and I should say we're speaking now totally from our personal views. This is not necessarily something that has any direct connection to the evidence in our research, but I think something that we would be supportive towards is something like banning algorithmic recommendations of content on social media. That seems, that doesn't require you to make decisions about which kind of content you permit and don't permit, which are the kinds of decisions that it's dangerous to allow the government to make. But it's a way of just in a simple, clear, bright line way, toning down or turning down the intensity of competition for attention and encouraging people to interact with media in a more deliberate way where they're seeking out information and making more active decisions about what to engage with, rather than just passively consuming the carefully tuned to be attention maximizing content that's being served to them through a social media algorithm. So that might be one prescription that we would be comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. And here at Project Censored, we often say that we're not looking to constrict people's media consumption. The idea is to have a broad spectrum of media consumption and use critical media literacy to understand where people are trying to hide their bias, because there's no such thing as objective reporting, where people are honest about it, where that bias is twisting facts or news abuse or things like that. So I think the important thing is to use critical media literacy, and also I believe, to use and uplift alternative and truly independent media, because independent media that is not beholden to corporate overlords or the state is going to be more honest about facts on the ground than the others. So With that, y'all, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, the paper is called The Business of the Culture War by Shakked Noy and Aakaash Rao. Thank you both so much for taking the time to sit down with us and go through your paper. And thank you for putting all the research in and putting that out into the world.
Thanks so much for
It's a
having
pleasure.
us.
Thank you.